The Didrichsen Art Museum recently launched its first podcast episode about the story of the museum. It has already reached hundreds of listeners, and the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. My name is Maria Didrichsen, and I'm sitting in the living room of the Didrichsen Art Museum together with Jenny Didrichsen, who created the podcast. And now we will hear a little bit more about the making of the podcast. Welcome, Jenny.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here and to share with you a little bit more about the behind the scenes story of the making of this podcast.
So how and why, what inspired you to make this podcast?
For many years, I dreamt of finding a way to share the story of the museum with anyone, anytime and anywhere in the world. And last year I heard an episode on the story of the Guggenheim Art Museum in New York. And while I was listening to this podcast episode, it was kind of like a revelation. And that was when I realized that this is how I wanted to do it. And so this episode inspired me to create a podcast for the museum, and I used that episode kind of as a benchmark when creating this podcast. It was important to me to share the story of the museum because I wanted to honor my grandparents and the legacy they left behind. And I'm so happy that this has become a reality through the launch of this podcast episode.
Oh, wonderful. And what was the most challenging with the production?
The most challenging was definitely the recording of the voices for the podcast. We tried to be as cost efficient as possible, so we created kind of a home studio here in the museum, but we weren't able to record anything while we had visitors in the museum, so it meant that all of the recordings had to be done outside the opening hours of the museum. So it meant that either we were recording very early in the morning or very late in the evening, and so that's why it took much longer than we expected to finalize all of the recordings.
So, tell us about the voices. Who were they?
In the beginning, we planned to use professional voice actors because we wanted this podcast to be very professional, and we thought that was the right direction to go. But once we started working on the podcast and the more we thought about it, we realized that actually we wanted to make it as authentic as possible, and we wanted to use the real voices of the people behind the story. So we tried to do that as much as it was possible. So for example, I am my own voice, my parents are their own voices, but of course my grandparents aren't with us anymore, and so we used the professional voice actors for their voices and also for the narrators in the story.
So was it difficult to record your own voice?
Definitely. At first it felt quite uncomfortable. I'm sure a lot of people don't enjoy hearing their own voice, but then I got used to it. However, it's not very easy, and a lot of times we had to do many retakes of the recordings because I said something wrong or I ended up saying something very silly by mistake.
So can you give us an example of these silly episodes?
One of the funniest ones that I remember is I'm in the part of the story where I'm telling about my grandparents and that they loved hosting these dinner parties. And I said that a lot of times at these dinners, they had dinner with the sculptor Eila Hiltunen. And I didn't even realize that I had said something wrong. Maybe you didn't either know. Until my mom started laughing and I asked her what's wrong. And she told me that I had said they ate with the sculpture. And that's when I realized I should have said sculptress. So we actually wasted 1 hour of time because every time we tried to retake this sentence, I started laughing. And this happened a lot of times with other incidents as well. And for example, one of the narrators, who's a professional voice actor, he said that the Didrichsen family maintained a very close relationship to artists and the art world for 30 generations. And he also didn't realize that actually he said it wrong and it's supposed to be 3 generations only.
This was quite interesting and funny at many times during the production. Well, what will happen now in the project?
We're trying our best to promote the podcast internationally. We want to reach as wide an audience as possible. And I'm hoping that as many people as possible have the opportunity to hear the story of the museum and that they would be inspired to maybe one day in the future also visit us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.